Who are you?
I am an artist, a cartoonist.
The Naked Pastor. How did you get that name?
I was a pastor at the time. I left official ministry in 2010.
Do you still consider yourself a Christian?
Do you believe in God? Well, wait a minute. What do you mean by God?
The book, The Silence of Jesus, very disruptive book.
Hate is reactionary. No to gay people. No to women. No to race. No to minorities. Why is conservatism so loud, so violent, and hateful right now?
Welcome to today's episode of Getting to Know You. I'm your host, Cameron Edward Benton, and on today's episode, I have the great pleasure of introducing you to David Hayward, otherwise known as the Naked Pastor. If you're going to search him, make sure that that is all one word, because otherwise you will find pictures of actual naked pastors, which I'm guessing you do not want. That said, David is a absolutely remarkable human being. He's an artist, he's a cartoonist, and he's an author who focuses around the spiritual journey that follows deconstructing Christianity. In this episode, we talk about David's own journey that led him to leaving the church after being a pastor of 30 years and becoming an artist full-time. We talk about his most important book that led to that journey. And we talk about tips for somebody who might be going through that process themselves. We also cover the effects of spiritual trauma and whether or not he still considers himself a Christian today. So if you're interested in topics like this and other guests, make sure to hit the subscribe button. And without further ado, here is Getting to Know David Hayward, the Naked Pastor. Who are you?
Hey, thanks for having me on your show, by the way. But who am I? David Hayward. I am an artist, a cartoonist, and somebody who's very interested in spirituality and how it intersects with life and society, culture, community, and justice issues. So that's pretty much what I'm focusing all my work on these days.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And you're well known on Instagram and YouTube as the Naked Pastor. I'm curious, how did you get that name?
It's kind of funny, actually. I got that way back in 2005, I think it was, when the Naked Chef, Naked Archaeologist, The Naked Truth, all those things were popular at the time. And I thought, well, I was a pastor at the time. I pastored a local church, and there were a bunch of pastor bloggers at the time, and I thought, I want to do a blog, but I want it to be different. So my take was I was going to blog, like pull back the curtain, let everybody see what really goes on in the life of a pastor, a minister, a priest, whatever, and what really goes on in the life of a church, the good, the bad, the ugly. And so I came up with the name Naked Pastor. And I've sometimes I wish I hadn't chosen that, because I know I get a lot of heck over it, and a lot of people say they can't access it because, I don't know, it's getting flagged or whatever like that. But it quickly grew into something that is alive and well in the world, and a lot of people have heard about it, and I guess it's like a brand. And so I feel I'm kind of have a love-hate relationship with that name. But I feel like I'm still doing what I chose the name for, and that is pulling back the curtain on what's really going on in spirituality, religion, especially as applies to Christianity and the
So
church.
you talked about being a pastor when you started doing that. Are you still a pastor today?
Well, some people would argue over that. I left the ministry, official ministry, in 2010. So it's been 14 years since I actually had a church. But a lot of people insist that I'm still doing the same kind of a work as a pastor, but online with people. So it's, flip a coin, whatever, heads or tails, I don't know. But I love what I do, and I do feel like I've been, trained and prepared for this. I don't have a local congregation, but I do feel like I'm performing the same kind of a role or function in the world, but online. Yeah.
What role and function is that?
Well, just helping people along, supporting them, validating them, encouraging them in their own spiritual journeys, their own spiritual walks. Um, and I do a lot of cartoons as relates to LGBTQ people, feminism, abuse, spiritual abuse, religious trauma, all kinds of issues like that. So I feel like the my my concern for people and helping them in their daily walks, and how they can have the courage to truly be their authentic selves. That to
Hmm.
me is I'm very passionate about. First of all, I'm very passionate about my own need to be free to be my authentic self, and I think everybody deserves that same freedom.
Yeah, that was something I was going through your comics. I was going through your website, and a lot
Mhm.
of the theme that I saw through a lot of that was this a really powerful sense of the importance of freedom to you. See,
Mhm.
a lot of conversation I've seen you get into, and I'm curious as someone who's born in the church, and I was born and raised in the church, and um,
Mhm.
left is a word that I don't necessarily use because for me, my own journey, I was fortunate enough to go to a really beautiful Christian school that allowed me to ask big questions, and really they were like, hey, as long as you can argue, coherently and back it up for whatever you believe in, we're cool with it. And that was a really huge freedom piece for me because I went to a school that allowed me to, also be surrounded by a bunch of great friends that were also going through that same process. And I know the term that you use and a lot of Christians use now is like deconstructing. And essentially, that's what we were doing. We were kind of deconstructing and reconstructing as we were going along.
Yeah.
And I'm curious for you with the importance on freedom was were you in the church and feeling as if you couldn't be free? Like, why was freedom so important to you?
So I grew up in a family where it was pretty tightly run and controlled by my father, and he was a cop and an authority figure, and uh, he was a cop at home too. So, and I was the oldest of five kids, and so I felt very responsible and everything. But at the same time, I could tell I was different or unique, and I wanted to live my uniqueness. I wanted to be authentic, but I felt constantly um, sort of pushed down or pushed back or controlled or whatever, a ton of expectations placed upon me, which, on the one hand is kind of normal, but on the other hand, I wanted to be more expressive of who I was than I felt like I was allowed. Then you heap on top of that growing up in a Christian culture that's quite conservative, I and a church culture that's quite controlling, and I just felt like I had to walk on eggshells all the time. I had to be very careful about how I express myself and so on. And I knew very early that I was an artist. My dad was an artist on the side, so I was always around art, and I was always drawing and painting ever since I can remember. And then got into music and all that kind of stuff. And so that kind of creative artsy fartsy spirit kind of a thing
Mhm.
uh, uh, didn't feel at home ever where I was, and I felt always like I had to be very cautious, walk cautiously, and and then I went to Bible college, I went to seminary, went into the ministry, and then the church culture. I always tended to gravitate towards churches where I felt I could be somewhat myself, and I was pretty mostly lucky that way, where I did end up in churches where I felt I had adequate freedom that I was content with at the time. But then I would discover that the box I was in was too small, and I'd move on to the next box, which was larger. Then finally, my last church that I was the pastor of, that I left in 2010, it was a huge box, but I eventually found its limits and realized the only way I can keep growing as an individual, uh, and protect that right and responsibility of mine, and also out of concern for the church, not to ruffle its feathers too much
Mhm.
and unnecessarily, I decided it was time for us to part ways. And so that's what happened in 2010.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm curious about the you mentioned the different boxes and kind of getting to points where like, oh, you kind of outgrow this different box. And
Yeah.
it's definitely an expression that I use. I remember writing I think a paper to get into grad school, and I was talking about how when I first entered my university experience, I felt like God was in a box, and then by the time I left, it was like my God was so much bigger than whatever I could have imagined, or this concept of God, however you want to describe it, the universe, lots of different ways
Yeah.
to talk about what that word means.
Yeah.
But it was so much grander, really, than I could have ever comprehended. I'm curious for
Mhm.
you, like what were, I know I'm kind of asking you to go backwards in time, so if it's difficult, it's totally okay. But like, what were some of those like boxes that you found yourself in, like as you were growing and hitting, like what were some of those ceilings that you would kind of reach and then go like, you know what, this isn't for me. Like, what were some of those like, I guess, inflection points that really made you look for something different?
Mhm. So for me, what really, um, yeah, we talk about deconstruction, which is basically I stole that word, co-opted it from the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who invented the word deconstruction. So it's a form of philosophy. But the way he wrote about it, when I was reading it way back in 2008, reading Derrida and others, uh, it sounded like what I was experiencing, where you don't only question the text, you question everything around the text, the source, the transmission, the culture from which it emerged, everything about the text, and that's exactly what I was experiencing with the Bible, which to most Christians is book one, and so I grew up in a home where the Bible was center, and grew up in the church where the Bible was center. And then I went to Bible college where the Bible was center. And then I went to seminary to study biblical theology. And I got my master's in theological studies, emphasis in New Testament. And, so I was very Bible centered. But it was on the day of my graduation from seminary when I suddenly started questioning, wait a minute, and I didn't learn this at seminary because it was a evangelical conservative seminary. I had read a book on the side, and it kind of um, threw a wrench into my whole uh, dogma about the Bible being inspired, infallible, inerrant, all those things. And it was devastating. And that was the beginning of my deconstruction decades ago. Decades.
What,
That's when I was
what,
just graduating from seminary. And so
what was the book? If I can just ask about
yeah,
that real quick.
I'm glad you asked that, because whenever I've mentioned that book before, people are like, what was the book? What was the book? So an obscure little book. I don't even know how many copies it might have sold, but it was in the Harvard book store in the Coop. And it's a little book called The Silence of Jesus by James Breach, where he sort of comes to the conclusion that out of all the sayings and actions of Jesus in the Gospels, there are perhaps seven sayings of Jesus that are authentic.
Hmm.
And so then he analyzes those seven sayings with a sort of a Nietzschean hermeneutic, and it was. I still have the book. I read it every once in a while,
Hmm.
because it just it 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 opened my eyes, but it devastated me at the same time. And I so I had to deal with this. It was almost like a corrupt computer code was thrown into my theological brain and started doing its work. And it just, so the way I had to deal with that was, okay, how can I keep functioning as a Christian believer, pastor, while still questioning the very foundation and source of everything I thought I believed, right? So it was that tension. Some people, the way they do that is they block out the new information,
Mhm.
and they go back to their previous theological standpoint and try to ignore that revelation or whatever that flash of insight. Others are like, oh my God, I've been duped and the whole thing was bullshit and I'm moving on. And there's those ways. My way was I wasn't willing to throw it out, the Bible, but I wasn't willing to swallow it hook, line, and sinker the way I was told to believe it. So I had to deal with that tension all the way through my 30 years of ministry.
Wow.
Was I value the Bible, but I don't necessarily believe it's inspired, divine.
Yeah.
So I had to wrestle with that all the way through my ministry.
Yeah. How did you personally like reconcile that tension? Because that's a heavy tension, and 30 years is a long time to live with that tension. And like, was that something you were fairly open about as a pastor? Was it something that was more between you and your
Oh,
wife or close friends, or how did you deal with that?
that was more my own spiritual journey. So I never felt like I was lying from the pulpit. I never felt like I was being untrue or lacked integrity. I would teach from the Bible because I think the Bible has values and has lessons and so on. Um, but it was really my own personal journey. How do I how do I survive this? How do I travel through this? I remember a theologian I really loved, Karl Barth, Swiss theologian.
Mhm.
He said uh, he advised when you face a problem not to go around it or under it or above it, but through it. And so that's what I chose to do. I'm gonna go through this because I don't want to reject the Bible, and neither do I want to naively and blindly just accept it as it was handed to me, with all of the disclaimers or whatever. So,
Yeah. No,
and
that makes.
so I at first wrestled with the interpretation of texts. That's the first step for many people. Is like, okay, what does it mean when it says? Does the Bible really condemn homosexuality? Does the Bible really forbid women from teaching a man? Does the Bible really forbid us from whatever?
Mhm.
And so that was my first way. And I kept running into walls there
Mm.
because I do argue this, that biblical scholars will argue until the last day on earth over what they'll
Yeah.
always argue over what the text means. Nobody is ever going to come to an agreement on all that. So I had to face the fact that I don't think I can come to an answer. And it came to this place where I the way I describe it is that my mind was just churning with theological angst. I could not figure it out. And I was almost ready to throw in the towel, actually. Like
Mm.
in order to keep going with integrity, I can't keep doing this, and then I want to share an experience with you, and I really have a difficult time articulating what happened, but what happened on an afternoon. It was March 9th, 2009, and I just had this picture pop into my mind and of a waterfall, and I immediately knew what it meant, and I I just saw that I just saw the unity of all things. It was like this profound sense of the togetherness and the unity, the oneness of all things. A lot of people say, "Were you taking mushrooms or something?" No, I was totally clean, and but I just had this overwhelming sense of oneness. Now, I've been reading, Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. I've been reading Hindu philosophy. I've been reading Sufi philosophy. I've been reading Eastern philosophy, Krishnamurti. I've been reading other Christian mystics, Meister Eckhart. I've been reading philosophers, living and dead. Um,
Mhm.
Slavoj Žižek, a living philosopher, and I've been watching and listening to them and reading them, and then quantum physicists, David
Mhm.
Bohm, Carlo Rovelli, all these things, right? And it was like I had this sense that all of these people in all of these realms were basically talking about the same thing, but using their own language appropriate to their field. And on that day in 2009, it just like I just saw it. I felt it in my bones, and this peace of mind came to me that I'd never had and that I've been waiting for, and it's never left. And it was just like, and in summary, what I saw was there's one reality, but we all have our own perspective on it. We all have our own uh, worldview through which we filter what we see and experience. And, we have our own languages and ideologies through which we communicate what we saw or what we experienced and everything. This applies to individuals, it applies to ideologies, it applies to religions, philosophies, spiritualities. There's only one reality. Albert Einstein, thank you. But there are millions and millions, as many people. There are interpretations and descriptions of this one reality, but that's all they are. They're just words and ideas. But there's that oneness that holds us all together. Now, some might call that the universe. Some might say that's love. Some might call that quantum energy. I don't know what you want to call it. But I just feel that that's there. And so that for me, that experience, I started, it was so profound for me and I wanted to share it. I started sharing it on my blog, Naked Pastor. And that's what started getting me in trouble with the church and with, the higher ups and everything. And I was getting phone calls and so on. And I knew my time was up. And sure enough, a year later, was when I decided I could no longer stay in the ministry and decided to leave to do what I'm doing now. Yeah.
Wow. I have so many questions from that story.
I do too.
Well, I mean, feel free. I mean, I'm happy to give you even my perspective on some of the things. I mean, I think like one of the things we talked about was, so I worked in neuroscience for 4 years of my life. I was director of sales for a neuroscience company, and we actually worked to help people basically achieve the equivalent of decades of meditation in 5 days using a technology called neurofeedback. And one of the frequencies okay, cool. Yeah. So one of the frequencies that occurs in the brain, and it happens with people who have meditated typically for a long time, and happens in other types as well, is this frequency of gamma. And one of the things that people experience with gamma is this unity consciousness experience. And there are lots of ways that one can experience that. It can be through meditation, it can be through inquiry and insight, it can be through, taking a bite out of an apple. There's a lot of reasons of why this kind of thing happens. But it is a universal experience for people who have kind of this spiritual awakening and insight of a sense of like, oh, we are all one. And that's not I totally, I want to be clear to anybody who's listening. I completely resonate. If this sounds like something where like, oh yeah, I've heard that before. It's a thought process, or it's like how you understand. It's not an intellectual understanding, right? It's a felt experience. And you might have an image like a waterfall that was associated with it. The first time I had it was when I had all these like gray cinder blocks basically all merged together, and it was just like in a flash I saw everything and how everything was connected. And that is something that is deeply transformational, right? When you have that, because you do feel and see and know, you know on an experiential level that everything really is connected and one.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's very accurate. And the thing is, what's important to me, and I think important socially, is, and in terms of love, which to me that's the word I use most of the time to explain the glue, let's say, that holds us all together, is that even though there's that sense of overwhelming oneness, it does not erase the distinctives of each part.
Hmm.
That to me is one of the most important aspects of what I saw. It's not like I saw a stew where everything sort of just blends together and it becomes this neutral kind of middle ground soup, whatever. It's somehow that unity and diversity idea where there's the oneness, but that each has the right and the privilege, the responsibility to maintain its distinctives
Hmm.
without becoming exclusive. That's the trick. When
Yeah.
when 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 we become when we relish our distinctives to the point where we become exclusive and think we're the best, and to the exclusion of all others, then that's failed. That's a failed idea in my opinion.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's very, very important, is to maintain that tension of unity and diversity. And so for me, that boils down to something very, very practical, right down to our one-on-one relationships and in church relationships and everywhere. Is the I think if we wrestle with the question, how can I be free and be me without violating your freedom and your unique authenticity? Like, so if my wife and I can wrestle with that question, how can I be my authentic self, be free to be my authentic self without violating hers
Hmm.
freedom to be her authentic self? And how can she be her authentic self without violating mine? That is the question, I think, that will foster healthy, functional relationships, right from, you know, one-on-one to communities to, you know, countries and the world. So that to me, I think, is a valid and important question that we need to be asking ourselves.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. I think there's so many things and ways, just in a lot of ways, like the Bible or a lot of spiritual things over time, right, that can get
Yeah,
used or misconstrued. A lot of people have, on psychedelics or even through meditation, like a huge spiritual awakening followed by a huge spiritual ego, right? That can be very much like
yeah,
a superiority complex, a God complex, all of these other things that happen. And for
yeah.
me, I think one of the ways that I see unity or the all oneness is understanding that if I'm harming someone else, I'm harming myself, right? There is no separation. You actually have a beautiful line along this lines of like, the only thing that divides us is language. And I love that line because I think that that's spot on. I'm known for around my friend group. I really love this saying that isn't 100% true, but I say that like math is wrong, and it's not that I think that math within the system is wrong, but to your point, like math is not reality, right? For math to actually work, you have to have two things, one plus one. It means you have to have two of the exact same things. And in the world, in reality, there are not two of any of the exact same thing. If you go down, like take two fish, for example, right? You go all the way down to the atom, like those atoms are there's a different amount of atoms in each of those fish, and even if you went down to the atoms, like those atoms are spinning at different frequencies. The
Yep.
electrons are at different amounts, and disappearing and reappearing at different times.
Yeah.
So like there aren't any two things. Now math is a great framework, right? And one of my favorite philosophers who's been a big teacher of mine indirectly has been Alan Watts, and one of the
Right.
things that he often says is, um, because we are confusing signs with nature, we are destroying nature, right? We mix up the tools or the ways of distinction or these things with the thing itself. And he
Mm.
he has a very famous talk where he will go, um, you know, reality isn't words, reality is, and he'll hit like a gong. But the point being, like, that's reality, not the words that we're using to describe it. All of that is a way that we're doing our best to kind of talk about it. And it's
Hmm.
important to understand that there's a distinction, not to not use the distinction, but to understand that it is a distinction. It is flawed fundamentally.
Yeah, it's like Krishnamurti. Do you know who I mean when I say Krishnamurti?
The name's familiar, but you could please refresh
Okay,
me because I don't know that
Eastern.
as
He's
well.
an Eastern philosopher. He died in the 70s or 80s. Um, Fascinating character. Uh, and he wrote one of the most influential books in my life called The Urgency of Change. It's a tiny little penguin pocketbook, and it it literally rocked my world. So it's in my top 10 books of all time, along with The Silence of Jesus that I mentioned earlier. Uh, my top 10 books are books that have changed my life. And he says the same thing. The word is not the thing. The word is not the thing. And so, like, that's why, uh, when somebody says, "Do you believe in God?" Well, wait a minute. What do you mean by God? Because the word God is not God. What do you mean by that? Because whenever anybody asks you, "Do you believe in God?" That's packed. There's a lot of baggage with that word, and
Mhm.
each depending on who's asking it, right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
if it's a Muslim asking you, or a Christian, or a Roman Catholic, or a Hindu, or an atheist,
Mhm.
like that word God is packed with tons of baggage. And so, and I do a lot of cartoons about that, where um, the even the idea of God is not God, or the word God is not God. And Krishnamurti is saying, have you ever wanted to know what's beyond the word or beyond the idea? Very few people have that kind of curiosity or courage to ask that. What's beyond the word? What's beyond the idea? If there is anything. So yeah, I like that. And when I say language is what divides, it reminds me of that story in the Old Testament, where the Jewish Bible, where um, the Tower of Babel, uh, humankind was operating and working together to build this great tower, and God was like, "Wait a minute! If they keep this up, they're going to reach up into heaven. We got to change this." So what did they do? God introduced languages, different languages, and nobody could no longer communicate with each other, and they all went in their own way, and you know, uh, populated their own lands. So in that case, yeah, language divides. And again, I want to emphasize this does not mean we need to create a world language. I know there are efforts to do that, but I think we need to value our language, and languages, and preserve them, and each uh, own them and respect our distinctives and so on. But at the same time, is there a way we can realize that we can love one another despite the different words or even ideas that we espouse? So I think
Yeah.
that's key, especially today.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I'm a bit of a lingua-phile. Like I love language. I haven't taken the time to learn a bunch of other languages, but even just understanding our words. I trained as an actor for several years, and one of my favorite classes, ironically, it was like a diction and language course. And one of the things that they taught us was how throughout language, whether it was English or other languages, there are these universal principles, right? That we would learn how to use them as an actor, and we would see them in Shakespeare. But if I use the word love, for example, right, it's a very emotional word, and it's full of vowels, right? It's
Mm,
love. You can really feel and hear it. Amore. All of these different love words typically kind of carry that essence, whereas very intellectual words like intellectual, right, are very consonant driven, right?
yeah,
Competitive, these very like kind of words, and like almost
emphatic. Yeah,
all curse words are stop plosives, right? I won't say on here, but like they're very like they hit you hard, and this is across cultures, right?
mm,
It transcends it. There's an essence to it. Like I really believe that like language, it comes from something deeper, and then we kind of figure it out. Like there's a, I forget who said it, but it's true, where like the dictionary doesn't define what a word is, it explains how people use it. And I think that that's a really useful point as we consider things as language continues to develop and grow, how we integrate and synthesize things, and also understand how language shapes our world, right? Like
Mhm,
my it,
mhm.
like, English is a very precise language. It comes from a German heritage, so it has a very precise, articulate, very distinguishable things. Where if you use a Romance language, a lot more of the nuance there is in how you're expressing it, right? Whether it's Italian or French or Spanish, there's a lot more. Italian is a whole hand gesture thing, and the hand gestures mean things, right? They change what you're saying and how you describe things. It's how you're communicating. So I don't know.
That's cool.
I love that fascinating stuff to think about.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that is cool.
yeah. I'm curious with I wanted to circle back to the book, The Silence of Jesus, and you talked about it being a very disruptive book for your life and your journey, and it's something that you still go back to. I'm curious, what is it that is in that book that you have come back to and returned and continue to get something from it over and over again? Are there key lessons or frameworks or pieces of insight that you are able to share?
Well, so you know, it, it not only undermined my bibliolatry at the time, where the Bible was front and center. I kind of compare it to a Jenga block tower where the Bible held the whole thing up, but when that was removed, the whole tower started to wobble.
Hmm.
And so that's what my theological life felt like since then. But it also, because he was examining the sayings of Jesus and therefore the life of Jesus, uh, it made me realize that what I knew about Jesus was second, third, fourth hand information from people claiming to be disciples or people who knew him.
Hmm.
And the whole oral tradition thing, the first gospel wasn't written until like 40 years after Jesus apparently lived. And that's a long time, and we all know how uh, stories change
Right.
as they get passed along. So it didn't just undermine um, the authority of the Bible for me. It undermined my idea of the historical Jesus and how that relates to the theological Christ. You know, so
Hmm.
like, even was there a Jesus? Because and this is where deconstruction comes in. Like when somebody says Jesus said, you know, you must be born again. Well, actually, no. John, somebody claiming to be John, said that Jesus said.
Hmm.
It's not Jesus said. You can't just say simply Jesus said. Somebody claiming to be John, the apostle, claims
Right.
Jesus said that. And
Hmm.
so that's where deconstruction comes in. And then, it's kind of like the thin end of the wedge. Once you start going down that road, all kinds of questions start to emerge. But I really appreciated Breach's approach to the sayings of Jesus that he felt were authentic, because it just sort of uncovered this sort of very human, um, wandering rabbi, and who was a teacher and used stories to convey meaning. And you know, there's the absence of asserting himself as someone important or even as God, and
Hmm.
uh, and even asserting the existence of God, the Jewish God or whatever, Hebrew God. And so, yeah, it was that's and so even to this day, I think about that book very often, at least once a week.
Oh.
So I guess it's my Roman Empire. Where, how often do you think of James Breach, The Silence of Jesus? Quite
Right.
a lot, quite a lot. Because um, I have to share that I get a lot of hate online because of my cartoons and the stuff I write about and stuff. And I just know that's just not in the spirit of the Jesus, I think, that underlies the stories in the Gospels. That kind of
Mhm.
militant, hateful, right winger
Mhm.
who can't wait to see you burn in hell if you disagree with them. That's not the.
Yeah.
That's not. So when I encounter that kind of hatred and violence and fundamentalist uh, zeal, uh, I just realize, holy smokes, that's just so far off from what I feel we should be interested in. Instead
Yeah.
of you know building weapons for war, we should be building paths to peace. But
Yeah.
people seem to prefer weapons these days. So that's what keeps me coming back to that book.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. What you said reminds me a lot of my own journey and what I've seen from other people, how
Hmm.
it is this strange irony, and I also think it is, as a friend mentioned to me recently, that it's actually a part of our tradition in a way. It's the essence of Jesus in a deeper way, that it is following in Jesus's footsteps or examples, or that essence, like trusting in the things that you learned through
Hmm.
growing up that actually leads to leaving it, right? Because there is this place where you're going, wait, we were talking about, wolves in sheep's clothing, but like, the wolves in sheep's clothing aren't outside. There's nobody out there wearing, the sheep's clothing. All the wolves wearing sheep's clothing are on the inside, right? It's
Yeah.
the You see the repetition of the Pharisee story happening all around you, of people preaching the letter of the law but losing the spirit of the law. There's all of this stuff that's there, and like, as I went through my own journey, and I've seen it through so many different people's, it's, you start going, well, I have to upset something, right? It's like, there's I think it's the one of the statements in the passages where Jesus mentions, like, I'm not here to, where he's there to turn like brother against brother, and I think sometimes that gets misconstrued. But I think a lot of it is like, if you're really living in this life, and if you're going through this race, you're gonna rub some people the wrong way. You're gonna create confrontation with people that you were born and raised with, because a lot of people don't want to examine these things. They don't want to actually look at love from this bigger, grander scale. I mean, it's one of my own personal gripes with a lot of theology, where people will often give excuses of, well, you don't understand God's love, and that's why he has to send people to hell or whatever. It's because God's love is unfathomable. But like, to me, that's completely rational. Like that is a very human understanding of love. It is far more difficult to imagine that anyone, the worst people possible, are still worthy of love. Like, that kind of thing is much harder to wrap my head around than it is to, like, understand punishment and reward. That is an incredibly human aspect. But like
Hmm.
divinity, God's love, that bigger love that is really incomprehensible, is like, can you love that person who like did the worst thing possible to you? Not like let them into your life and let them keep abusing you, but can you forgive them? Can you see the person in there that's deeper than all of this? I think is so much more difficult than finding an excuse for why someone who, slept with somebody of the same gender is burning in hell because they were different or didn't follow the rules.
Hmm. Well, I I think it's a kind of a vicious circle. My personal uh, opinion on this is that we often think, a lot of people think that theology shapes our ideas and our hearts. I think it's the other way around. I think people gravitate towards theologies that justifies their feelings and behavior. So it's like people who are mean and closed-minded and narrow thinking, and uh, they're going to find a theology that suits them. And people do that. We see it all the time. If somebody doesn't like a certain preacher, they'll move on to a different church or whatever. That's normal. That's what people do. I think it that's a testifies to the fact that we're we're going to land eventually where we are agreeing with what's being preached because it suits our demeanor
Hmm.
and our ideas and our thoughts. Very seldom, I think, are people sort of struck by lightning, and I don't necessarily mean this as supernatural or divine or anything, but are given a flash of insight of, wow, I am not a loving person. I need to be a loving person, and change their lives. That happens, but not as often as I would like to see. You know what I mean? Or it's almost like people won't change their minds unless there's some kind of trauma
Hmm.
that provokes a change.
Yeah.
And we see it where people are totally adamantly against LGBTQ people, and suddenly their son comes out, and all of a sudden they start changing their minds. Trauma.
Yeah.
Then they realize I've got to change. I can't fathom the idea of my son spending eternity in hell. Let me
Hmm.
reconsider this. And they go and think and study and whatever, and then they come back. You know, I think God loves LGBTQ people, and I don't
Hmm.
think the Bible does condemn homosexuality and blah blah blah. Right? So,
Yeah.
uh, that's my take on that.
Hmm.
Is you know we gravitate towards those ideas that we've prepared for,
Hmm. Yeah,
like
that's
a
interesting.
container
Hmm.
almost.
Yeah. I think where I would push back a little bit on that is I think that part of why that person changes isn't so much to not have their son or daughter go to hell, which can be part of it. But I think that a big part of it is actually experiencing that person. And
Yeah.
for me, I'm curious about your own epistemology, but like for me, one of my kind of deep beliefs is that we don't know anything. I think the only thing that we really know is experience, right? Because for me, it's like I kind of go to like Descartes with this, where it's like I can't really prove that anything exists, right? I can have this experience, but you could be an illusion, you could be a simulation, you could be a demon, a god, an angel, whatever, right? It could be a zillion things
Mhm.
or just something in my mind, but I can't deny that I'm having experience of you. And so for me, like knowledge always starts with experience. And I think that what happens is that our our beliefs and our love starts to grow when we actually experience the humanity of others. I actually think that's what's happening globally across the world. And actually think that's why we're actually seeing some levels of extremism with some conservative ideologies pop back up, is because I think that they're actually close to dying. And one of the things that we see with different belief systems that happen is when um, things are kind of on their last breath, they kind of throw a last hurrah. There's a big kind of revitalization of them, and then they start to like dissipate because people are, I think, waking up, honestly, even though it gets a lot of flack, I think part of it is like genuinely through social media, because people are able to see so many different people in a very visceral and real way and connect with different people and see how we are all much similar than we ever really realized before. And so I think it's like through that experiential understanding of love, of seeing that this person is not different than I am. You actually write about it, I think, somewhere, or I heard you talk about it, something to the extent of God, I can't place it right now, but something to that same idea where it's I can't remember where I was going anymore, but I think you get where what I was saying, or if not, you
Yeah.
can ask me.
No, it's no, it's. I agree. I agree. It's the experience of it. That contributes to the trauma of people being forced to reconsider their position.
Mhm.
And I have talked a lot about that lately. Is why is conservatism so loud right now, and
Mhm.
and so violent
Mhm.
and hateful and power hungry and restrictive and so on. And I think it's because it's reactionary. I think hate is reactionary to as when I think now compared to say 10 years ago, the LGBTQ or pride and all that. it's way louder now. It's way more out there now than it was. I know way more gays and trans and,
Hmm.
bis and gender fluid and every, I know a ton more, and I see it a lot more online. And so, it's almost like progress is the gas and
Hmm.
conservatism is the brake. And the harder the gas is pressed, the harder they're going to put on the brake. And
Hmm.
it's just, I think it's just reactionary. It's like the saying down in um, Latin America, something like love takes work, hate is lazy. And it is, hate is lazy. All it can do is react. It doesn't create new worlds or opportunities or whatever. It's just reacting. It's not a fresh idea. It's just saying no to gay
Hmm.
people, no to women, no to race, no to minorities of whatever.
Hmm.
And while progress, the progress of love is about inclusion and growing and acceptance and all this kind of thing. And so I think hate just reacts to that. And that's why it's so loud right now.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I yeah, it's beautifully put. I think that's very well said. Um, do you still consider yourself a Christian?
Well, there you go with the word. What's
Yeah.
the word? You know what I tell people? This is what I say. That my home is in Christianity, but I have cottages everywhere. And
Hmm.
so I don't. I'm one of those that I'm not willing to reject my roots, but I'm not. Neither am I going to let them limit me.
Hmm.
And so my roots definitely are in Christianity. My spiritual mother is the church and Christianity and so on. And I have a lot to be grateful for. I wouldn't be who I am today unless I was who I was then.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot to be grateful for, a lot to be thankful for. But I do feel like I'm going to go down a little bit of a rabbit trail
Please
here. Where
go.
so I used to think of growth, spiritual growth, as linear. But that didn't seem to do, because what I pictured was a snail crawling along, leaving a slimy streak behind it, and moving on. And then I thought of growth as stages, sort of James Fowler stages of faith. And I
I'm not
I
familiar with those. If you want to actually,
pardon me.
what are I don't know the stages of faith. I'm not familiar
Oh,
with that.
James Fowler's Stages of Faith. Basically, I can't remember the exact titles, but you've got infancy, and then childhood, and then
Mm,
uh, adolescence, and then young adulthood, and then adulthood, and then
got it. Got
the
it.
final stage is universal love. But so and but then I didn't find that helpful after a while either. Although I'm very grateful to James Fowler for the stages of faith concept,
Mm,
but for me, it sort of gave the impression that as we went up in our stages, we looked down on our previous stages, sort of
mm,
condescendingly or whatever.
100%.
Now I think of growth as spatial, where we grow outward. And that means nothing's rejected. Like we grow outward and everything is included
Hmm.
somehow. That to me is a
Yeah.
healthier approach to growth. It kind of, you can count Jung in with, Jung, the psychologist Jung,
Hmm.
where you learn to integrate and assimilate everything that you've gone through,
Yeah.
and all of it, including your wild conservatism or Pentecostal background or whatever. It all
Yeah.
gets integrated and you grow spatially. And
Hmm.
so that to me is the way I think of growth now.
Yeah.
So when you ask me, am I a Christian? It's in there somewhere. But if you were to ask me, are you an atheist? That's also in there too.
Mm,
Or if I was a Buddhist or a Muslim or whatever, all those things, all those are like streams that are passing through what I call me at this
mhm,
time, right? I live on a river. It's called the Kennebecasis River, um, which is Mi'kmaq Indian for First Nations for many rivers, I believe. And it's a big river. It's huge, but there's many streams that have made that river. And so at any one time, um, you can go down and dip a glass into that river and say that's the Kennebecasis River, and you're kind of right, pointing at the glass, but you're kind of wrong too, because that's the whole river, and it's made up of many streams. And that's when somebody asks if you're a Christian, that's what I think of is like it certainly is a major stream in my story, but
Mm-hmm.
that's not the only stream, right?
Yeah.
So I'm very resistant to labels because they tend to categorize you. I personally don't need a label because, you know, the can of beans, the beans don't need the label. It's the people out there who need the label to figure out what's in the can,
Right.
right? So I don't need the labels, but other people get frustrated when they try to figure out what I am. But
Yeah.
that's their problem, not mine. I do my best to, like I've been trying to uh, explain to you just now how I answer that question. Are you a Christian? Yeah, it's definitely my family of origin. It's in my DNA, uh, but that doesn't limit me either.
Yeah. I recently came to my own understanding as of right now is that I'm Christian by culture. So I
Mm,
feel like in the same way that often Jewish culture can be somebody who's like, I don't believe in God, or I do believe in God, whatever it is, but there's a Jewish culture that kind of permeates everything else. It's a little bit different than just the religious aspect or the DNA aspect, but it's a part of who I am, right? The stories, the teachings are so ingrained into my DNA. I think you talk about this with some of the darker stuff, which I kind of want to get into. But it's right. There's not really a way that I can separate that part from me.
no,
I can't
I don't
exit
think
that.
you should either.
Yeah, it's a futile attempt in it, but only if anything cause more harm. But there is all this beauty and these other things that have come from it, and it's to your
Yeah,
point, it's about how do I integrate these things. I think bringing Carl Jung is a great example, right? The mandala, the synthesis of the square and the circle, where bringing these things integrated versus judging my past, which is something I've definitely dealt with, and I feel like over the last like 2 or 3 years, I've come to a greater reconciliation of not doing that, of being like, how do I integrate all these parts of myself? How do I merge these things and synthesize them into a greater understanding of who I am today?
yeah, I totally agree. Like, I think you say cultural Christian. I think didn't Richard Dawkins, the atheist scientist, just come out and say he considers himself a cultural Christian?
I don't know. I've never
Just
heard that. That'd be fascinating. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, it's like I always say to people, I wouldn't be who I am now unless I was who I was then.
Right.
And so if I were to go back and rip out a chapter of my life, the crazy part, let's say, um, I would not make sense as I am now because
Mhm.
that was a necessary part of my growth. So I don't want to look back on that period of my life with shame or regret or uh, try to suppress it and bury it in my subconscious and all that. Like I'm going to figure out how to integrate that. That's how you become an individuated person, is by
Right.
learning how to integrate all the aspects of yourself, including your dark side. And I think that's your shadow.
Right.
I think that's really important and healthy, a healthier way to do it. And that's what I try to do. Like I keep having to clarify myself where people think because I critique the church or some theology or whatever, that I'm against the church or against Christianity or religion in general. But no, I'm not. Actually, I value it myself, but can we please just do it right? That's my only, concern.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally get that. You've talked before about when you were in the church and really in it. One of the hardest things that's been for you to leave since you've left it has been there's that, I forget what you call it, but you call it like the intensity of intimacy, I believe, that you
Mm,
experience within the church that you don't necessarily have. And you talk about that with cults, and I'm curious about, because
Yeah.
you talk about the church isn't necessarily a cult, although depending on what angle you go to, I think you could. And I'm curious of what your definition even is for what a cult is or isn't. And I'll share mine first. 'Cause when I started to think about this more, when I started watching more about cults, when I started to see a lot of the same types of thinking that were in my subconscious that were coming from a similar type of trauma, from religious trauma, spiritual trauma, where for me, I also can see, and this is a gift I feel like for people who come from religious backgrounds, is you can kind of see dogma or you can see cultish behaviors even in things that are not religious or spiritual, right? It might
Oh,
be
yeah.
a cult of a technology or of a CEO or of a country, right? There are people who get caught up in a belief system without being able to actually question about it or look at the deeper principles or these other things. And for me, I think a cult is any kind of entity that ends up caring more about the entity itself versus about the people that it's meant to serve, right? So I think a lot about churches, or a lot of the message that I was often given was like, oh, keep bringing people to the church. And it's like, how do we keep the church going? How do we keep the church alive? It was always about the church rather than remembering like the church's purpose was to like take care of the people. And I feel like often, whether it's a product, whether it's a company, whatever it is, it's like that becomes a cult when it sort of loses that essence and it starts to, again, care more about this abstract concept we've built with our minds that we've convinced ourselves is real,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
actually is not, and ends up hurting all these people along the way.
I tend to think of cults more um, gathering around a person than institution. Now, I've never thought of it as institutional or organization, but I suppose that is possible. For me, all the cults that I've seen, or the cultic kind of communities that I unfortunately had been a part of, was it was about a person. You know, it's kind of like what we're seeing in the states right now, where Trump is a cult figure, in my opinion. People are absolutely, in adoration of him, whereas Democrats, I'm speaking generally, and liberals generally, are concerned more about policy and are willing to criticize their front runner or leader or whatever. That to me seems to be the real difference between both sides. Is
Yeah,
one is, really worshiping. I I don't mean literally worshiping, but well, yeah, some
yeah,
adoring a man, and others uh, willing to critique a man and wishing that he would step up to the plate on some issues and things like that.
right.
So yeah, so for me, when I when I left the ministry in 2010, one of the most acute things that I felt was loneliness. And Lisa and I, my wife and I, had always been a part of churches that were very community minded, and really a lot of fellowship. And uh, we the church has the corner on the market, in my opinion, when it comes to this community building. I don't know of any other organization where you can walk in and become a member, and suddenly you're provided with things to do on weeknights, a place to give your money. You get some support. You've got access to babysitters. You might find some mechanics. You're going to have people bringing you meals when you're sick. You're going to have prayer support.
Yeah,
And sort of this real energetic vibe of being around people that share the same values. And so um, that is hard to walk away from many people. And when they do walk away from that and they experience a sudden loss of friendships and that sudden loss of community, it can be very devastating and take years to figure out and years to recover from. And so when I left the ministry in 2010, I also had to leave the church at the same time, my wife and I. And I became interested in, why does this hurt so much? Because I was ready to leave. And so I was watching some documentaries, like on Netflix and places, and reading stories about cults. And there was one on, I think CNN made one about one cult leader in Hawaii. I forget that one. And then there was the one, something about the West. I think that was with Osho,
Hmm.
um, about his ranch that he had in Colorado or somewhere. And then I was reading about Chogyam Trungpa, who also was in Denver, who started a Tibetan Buddhist monastery there, also here in Canada, not far from where I am.
Wow.
And, just other cults. And what amazed me was the amazing similarity to among those who'd left, where they knew they were being abused, like financially, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and some sexually and physically abused. And yet they were still crying because they missed the intensity of intimacy that they had in when they were there, and they missed their friends. And so that really got me thinking, okay, wait a minute, maybe those come together. Maybe that intensity of intimacy is sort of the culture in which a cult can establish itself. You know,
Yeah.
um, that maybe they combine to create that culture where it's high intensity. You're willing to give up everything, even your own autonomy, and be just to be a part of this amazing intimate fellowship. And yeah, I think that was one of the big eye-opening things for me was, yeah, I miss it, but maybe it's not necessarily that good for you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, there's still a lot to process there, because I spent most of my life in that kind of a church or Christian culture, and you don't just recover from that overnight. So I think and I keep talking about it, keep talking about that kind of thing on my blog and Instagram and all that, and people are like, give it a rest, give it up already. But there's so many people who are coming out right now, you know. I want to be there to help them.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I think you do. I mean, since I've followed you, I've had 20 or 30 plus friends that have, I think, followed you, and I know you've helped me in my own journey as I continue to unpack things, and you help a lot of people. So thank you
Oh
for
wow,
doing
cool.
that work.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and I guess it kind of pivots to a question that I had with relating to spiritual trauma. I know one of the things that you talk about is you have a comic, I believe, about this, about being 50 and being in a therapist's office and being like, I am still scared of the devil, right? I'm still scared of going to hell. And I'll share just a quick story about talking about this because I think it's really, really important, because especially if somebody I think is not from a religious experience and you're not understanding this, I think so often to somebody who's not raised in the church or is very lightly raised in the church, it is just like, oh, you're talking about, dragons, or you're talking about something from Harry Potter, right?
Yeah.
This make believe thing. But when you're born and raised into something like this, that it's your whole world, especially at a very, very young age, I think it is so viscerally in your nervous system that it's really, really difficult to shake and be aware of. And I remember when I was, I think, 5 years old, and I was playing a little game on my grandma, my mom, and I would like pretend to clean my room, and I would come out and be like, "Hey, mom and grandma, look at me! I'm being good and cleaning my room." And I would go inside and be like, "Oh, I'm not cleaning my room." And I thought I was like so sneaky and clever. And then like I kept doing that, and they like didn't catch on. And then at some point, I realized, oh my god, I'm lying, and I'm 5 years old, and I realized I'm going to hell. And I walked into, our little video game room, and I laid on the couch, and I just started curled up into a ball and started crying. And eventually my dad came in and checked in with me, and he was like, "Hey, what's going on?" And I was like, "I'm going to hell. I lied to mom, and I'm going to hell. Like, I'm going to hell." And he was like, "Oh dear." And he was like, "Well, pray to forgive and ask Jesus for forgiveness, and you'll be okay." So I did that. And it wasn't until I was telling that story in therapy, and my therapist looks at me and goes, like, "Do you still think you're going to hell?" And I was like, "Oh, shoot, I do." Like, I believed, and this was about a year ago. I believed that Jesus was going to come to save me, but I was still going in that direction. And it made me realize, just even in my theological thought process, how I grew up through the church, like so much of my brain power and mental angst was spent around, am I going to hell or heaven, right? Am I being truly Christian enough? Am I being close to perfect enough? Even if I'm asking for forgiveness, or just God knows that my forgiveness isn't a real ask, right? It's like we're given all
Yeah.
these pieces where it's like, oh, hey, yeah, all you have to do is ask for forgiveness. But then there's all these other like kind of stipulations really beneath that. Are you really repenting, or are you
Yeah,
just
yeah,
saying all this stuff? Like, I
yeah,
don't know. And so you're just kind of caught in this bubble of angst, and I didn't really realize how much that was affecting my life, until, like I said, about a year ago, where I had done all this philosophical and theological unpacking, but the emotional work on the nervous system level had really profound tendrils into my subconscious. And I
yeah,
was wondering if you could just talk about your own experience with that. I know you've even created, I think,
yeah,
an image.
yeah.
There's a woman with this kind of tendrils in her hair, kind of grabbing her, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I use the same kind of analogy of like a brain tumor, where you have different kinds of brain tumors. One might be a lump that's operable and can be removed, but then you have other kinds of brain tumors that have tentacles that just spread through your whole brain, and that's considered inoperable
Mm-hmm.
because it just invades the whole organ. And there's people out there who's like, well, why you stop believing in hell? Like, it's easy. It's like you stop believing in Santa and you moved on in life. You didn't have to go for therapy and all that kind of thing. Or you stop believing in fairies or monsters under the bed or whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
this is different because it's drilled into you from a very early age. It's hardwired, like basically brainwashing,
Right.
where you were actually hardwired to believe this stuff. So when I left the ministry, I was in my 50s,
Wow.
and I remember the night I quit. I announced I was quitting, and I came home, and Lisa was working. She's a nurse. She was working, and I just lied on the bed at night in the dark, and I just felt this cold fear just come over me, like, what have I done? You know, I've I've let down the church. I've let down God. I'm disappointed Jesus. I'm going to hell. Now, I'd already questioned the existence of hell, but it was just like so ingrained. It was like an auto response, right?
Right.
And it's like an emotional response. It's not even hardly an intellectual one. It was just automatic.
Right.
And you know, like I'm beyond that now, but every once in a while, it's kind of like an echo. Like at first, it yells at you, and then it fades into a talk, and then it fades into a whisper, and eventually it's an echo, and eventually it just goes away. And for some people, it takes longer than others. And my guess is that the more intense you were engaged in all that and involved in all that, the more intense your deconstruction is going to be.
Yeah.
And so um, it's I talk with people every day. Just hang in there, it'll pass. It's kind of like recovering from surgery. Yeah, it
Mhm.
hurts, but eventually it'll numb, and eventually you won't feel it anymore. And it's just the same. It's that kind of recovery, as if from uh, major surgery.
Yeah. I think
Yeah,
that that's a great analogy for it, because it it's something that hits you in a way that is very, very difficult to describe, because it's so anchored and rooted into your nervous system. It's so anchored
yeah,
into how you operate on a day-to-day level.
yeah,
And you know, I'm curious if you were giving, I know you kind of just did this, but if you were giving some advice to somebody who has been maybe on the edge of a deconstruction phase, or like they have some of these questions, or they have some of these fears, anxieties, and thought processes, like where would you recommend that they start, or how do you any advice on how to approach this in a way that is safe and gentle versus maybe running off the edge into the deep end and causing maybe more harm and rubber banding themselves into a place that's not so great, and maybe a more gentle
Yeah.
approach?
Well, I always say there's only one way to deconstruct, and that's your way. And one of the big deals of deconstructing is claiming your autonomy, your self-determination, your spiritual independence, your right to decide how to be spiritual. That's the first hurdle. That's the first big one. You have to get over feeling guilty for taking care of yourself. You have to get over distrusting your own gut. You have to get over minimizing the value of your own thoughts and the value of your own feelings. That's the first big hurdle, is realizing I no longer have to submit to spiritual authority. I am now going to take the wheel of my life. I'm going to be the master of my destiny. I'm going to be the captain of my ship,
Mm-hmm.
and taking control of your life, and then you get to decide how to proceed. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, and you can do that by starting to burn, you know, uh, incense, doing yoga, reading Buddhism, meditating, praying, going to church or not going to church. What, it doesn't matter. You decide what feels right. What do you think is going to help you the most? Because whatever's going to help you the most and feels right to you is going to be totally different than mine.
Yeah.
So, when people might look at my life and try to analyze it, they're not going to be able to answer the question if I'm a Christian or not,
Right.
because I'm a mixed bag.
Mm-hmm.
And my practice is all over the place, but I'm doing what helps me. I'm doing what helps me get from my point A to my point B, not his point A and his point B. And so that's what the advice I would give. You need to own up. You need to take control of your own life. You stop surrendering your independence, your sovereignty to other people, and take ownership. And you get to decide how to be spiritual from now on. And when you combine that with the truth that there's no judgment, there's no authority figure out there judging you for what you're deciding, then you're free. You're good,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I do remember the days when I said I'm going to take control of my life and feeling guilty, because I always was taught that Jesus is to control my life, not me. God was to control my life, not me. And so it took a lot of courage to take that step and say, I'm the boss of me, and,
Mm-hmm.
and take control of my life. And
Yeah.
that's not to say that I don't value gurus or guides or pastors and teachers and advisors and counselors and all that, but I get to choose,
Yeah.
and when and how much, you know, and it's like we're being escorted into a buffet that's gigantic, and you get to decide what to eat. You're a big boy now. You're a big girl now. You get to fill your plate with what you want, what you think is best for you, and what's most nutritious for you, and what's going to make you happy and healthy. And uh, that's the same goes spiritually. And I think that's the advice I would give people out there who are just on the edge of deconstructing. Yep, fasten your seatbelt, wear a helmet, but enjoy the ride.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. Um, I would love to, if you're open to it. Even though I 100% agree with you, I want to play devil's advocate to that. And the reason that I want to do that is because I think that there might be somebody who's listening to some of what you said, and I think would ask some questions that probably will resonate with you with your own unraveling over time, and definitely have resonated with me. And it comes back down to the level of trust, right? So one of the things you talk about is like, oh, I'm deciding for myself now. And if somebody is deeply in the webbings and trappings of spiritual trauma,
Right.
fundamentally the way that I see it with spiritual trauma, right, is like you're programmed, you're taught to distrust yourself because you
Hmm.
are
Hmm.
wrong. So if I can't do that. The whole reason that I can't do this because I am flawed, because I am born with original sin, or I'm guilty, I'm a flawed human being, so I have to surrender to that. Like how do you respond to something like that?
Well, I've come to the conclusion that anything that tries to scare you or control you, do not trust it. Because I think it was manufactured to control you and make you afraid and keep you in line. All that original sin thing and reward and punishment and all that is designed to make you afraid. And so most people who are deconstructing and they continue down that road begin to develop that distrust of anything that is trying to make them afraid, or anything that makes them feel that they should surrender their sovereignty to someone else. They start catching on. They can smell a rat. And you know that whole trust your gut thing, I know it's like a muscle. You have to train it. It's been atrophied for so long, because other people were telling you how you feel, not how you should feel, but how you actually feel. And so you developing that trust your gut muscle takes some time, but it can start just by saying, I'm going to decide to take care of myself and try not to cause harm. That's a good basic rule to start out with. And I don't mean by cause harm, I don't mean by that hurt other people's feelings. I mean like actually harming someone. So you're going to just start listening to what you're feeling, trying to get in touch with what you're feeling. What am I feeling? No, I don't want to do that. Or yeah, I do want to do that. Nobody's being harmed. I'm going to do this. And you just train that muscle to the point where you realize you can trust yourself to be a good person in this world. And and you'll get suspicious of all attempts to get you to fall back in line. And you know, I think that's an important part of our growth,
Yeah, I
to
I
maturity.
yeah, I think that's beautifully said. I think you know we talked about this a little bit, but with spiritual trauma, like the level of distrust that we are taught to have, because it's like, oh well, I can't do this. Well, it's like, well, God's
Oh yeah,
unexplainable, or you can't understand it, or or you
yeah,
actually feel this. And we're really, in a lot of ways, I was very much like programmed to move away from pleasure, and in a lot of ways towards pain, right? You're kind of praised for suffering in a variety of ways, right? And so it can become very, very disorienting. And I want to say, like, there are two things that have really helped me to unpack this as far as like phrases. One of them is again from Alan Watts, where he says, if you can't trust yourself, how can you trust the distrust of yourself? And that phrase for me has been wonderful, because it started making me realize how often, when I was caught in levels of distrust and self-doubt, how much of an endless spiral that is, right? You just start going down this endless rabbit hole of madness, and you're paralyzed, you can't make any decision. You
yeah,
start realizing that even if you're choosing to submit on some level, you're choosing that. You're trusting your whatever instinct or belief that you have, that to jump into that thing. Right. So you're
yeah,
you're trusting yourself even to do that. You actually
yeah.
can't operate from that deeper level. And I think the other thing for me that I would personally encourage, and has done a lot for me, ironically, I feel like, is to pray. I have found that, like, asking genuinely, if I am doing something horrifically wrong or whatever it is, if I'm not going down the right path, then, like, move it out of my way. And whether it's the universe, whether it's my own subconscious, I find that I feel safer. And I also find that this other path that I have gone down continues to open up and show me more love, show me more of God's um, grace, and love for other people, for myself, because I continue to fall into that. And I'm a big believer
Hmm.
in general of like jujitsuing whenever you can. So if there's like a painful thing, figuring out how to use its momentum against itself rather than try to combat
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah,
but yeah, I think to your point, like everyone has their own journey with it for sure.
yeah, yeah. That's cool.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Well, I mean, David, this has been a really, really lovely conversation. I'm really, really enjoying it. I am
Yeah,
curious, actually, with your own journey and how you've navigated since leaving the church. You left. You talk about like you went through bankruptcy after that process. You kind of lost a whole family and community, and yet from there you have built this incredible brand and incredible community around yourself. You know a thriving artist who's able to pay for his life and do the things that he wants to do. Like, can
yep.
you tell me a little bit about that journey and what that's been like for you to build this whole thing through social media and like wherever you even found the strength and courage and faith to do that?
I I just finished a book, really good book. I'm a fitness freak. I do a lot. Like I run and I rock and I do weights and I do breathing exercises and stretching and cold showers. The whole works.
Hmm.
And I try to eat well and all that kind of thing. And I just finished a book by Alex Hutchinson called Endure, uh, and or Endurance. I forget which. Endure or Endurance. Anyway, uh, basically, that's what I tell people is when they say, "How did you do it?" Like I just got reached out to by somebody yesterday saying they were an artist. They're very quite young.
Hmm.
How do they do it? I want to be an artist like you. I'm like, man, like I don't want to discourage you, but don't give up. Don't give up. Just don't give up. I mean, that's my biggest asset is I would not go away. I've been doing this for 20 something years,
Wow.
you know, selling my art online, more than that. And, when I started cartooning in 2005, 2006, and then somewhere around 2007 or something, they started getting noticed and some went viral and started taking like things I had no control over, except that I just kept showing up. And every day, I challenged myself to draw a cartoon every day. I thought I would give up after or run out of ideas after a month, but here I am, still doing it, and it's keeping me going. It's providing me with income and all that. But when I left the ministry, though, I had to really deal with my very negative attitude about business and selling and marketing and branding and money. And I knew I was, because we had to file for bankruptcy. Being in the ministry so long, we just were so broke and so in debt and everything. And so we filed for bankruptcy. And here we're in Canada, and it's a 7-year process. And so basically, we were 7 years just beyond after that, no debt but no money either, and me trying to make money as an artist. It was hard, man. But I knew I had to go to the University of Life and learn about money and business and art and selling and all that, and get over my hangups about it that had been instilled in me from my family of origin and from religion that you know basically taught me or gave me a spirit of poverty, like a poverty mentality. And I had to do a lot of work to cure myself of that. And I'm still not totally cured. I still have issues, but I'm still working on them, but I'm still making my living as an artist and a writer and a speaker and all that kind of stuff too. So you know 10 years ago or 15 years ago, if somebody told me I'd be doing what I wouldn't have believed them. I thought it would have been too good to be true, but here I am. I'm doing what I love, and people are appreciating it and supporting me through it. So it's wonderful.
Beautiful. Anything on the horizon for you? Anything upcoming or big projects or anything like that?
I got a couple of engagements down in the States. I'm going to be speaking here and there, and I've got a children's book coming out about
Oh
rainbow
wow,
sheep soon.
very
I'm
cool.
excited about. Man, that was hard work. I didn't
Yeah.
realize children's books were such serious business, man. Anyway, yeah. Uh, and yeah, I'm just feeling like Naked Pastor is getting more recognition out there. So it
Mhm.
comes with its blessings and curses. And the blessings are I feel like I'm getting exposed to more people who want my help, but I'm also getting exposed to more, like we were talking about earlier, the hate and violence that's out
Yeah.
there that responds to that kind of love and compassion. So, and we're seeing tragic things happening in the world that I think we need to be standing up against. And because love and love is for all. And I believe that with all my heart. And I would love to be living in a more peaceful and just world. And so I'm going to do my part to help it become so.
Beautiful. Well, David, I think
Yeah.
I will end on that. That was a lovely point to end on. Anything, where can people find you? Where can people touch? Anything that you want to plug before we sign off?
Yeah. My base camp is nakedpastor.com, and you go there, you can see everything that I'm doing. But I think of all my online communities, Instagram is my most active and the one that I find the easiest to moderate. X is impossible, Twitter. Facebook is less impossible, but I
Mhm.
find Instagram is a pretty cool place to, you know, moderate a community. So it's pretty cool over there. So follow me. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well,
Make
thanks,
it
David.
faster. It's all make it faster all across all the platforms.
Yeah, and I've heard you
Yeah.
say this elsewhere, so I'll say it for you. But look up for him with one word, not two words, or you will end up finding
Yeah.
actual naked pictures of
Yeah.
pastors. Which you may not want.
Yeah. 2 words, you'll see things you can't unsee. I promise. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, David, this was a blast. If you like this episode, make sure to hit subscribe. And David, thank you very much. I will talk with you later.
Thank you.